What an amazing lineup. Hello everyone. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, and wherever we are here, but also online, we're on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And First Nations people here have always been the first organisers, the first campaigners, the first movement builders. We stand on the shoulders of giants. A lot of the progress that has been seen here in this continent is directly due to the work of First Nations people. And to all the First Nations people here on the panel, but also in the audience, I pay my respects to your elders, past and present as well. So my name is Kirsty. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Australian Progress. Australian Progress is a behind-the-scenes capacity-building organisation for social change organisations and movements. We run trainings in campaigning and advocacy and provide back-end media support and messaging advice to campaigners working across the breadth of issues. And we deeply believe that our issues are interconnected and we're stronger when we work together. So it is my absolute pleasure to be opening and hosting this panel with this superstar group of people on intersectionality and solidarity in our movements. So I'll start by introducing them all, and then it's a short panel, so we'll get to hear a bit about each of them, and then I've got a few questions. So I'll start by introducing you, Noelene. Noelene, give her a round of applause, absolutely, and useful for me while I change my notes. So Noelene Nabulivou is a Pacific feminist and activist and executive director at Diverse Voices and Action, or DIVA, for equality. She's a lesbian feminist, community organiser, analyst, educator in Fiji, across the Pacific and the region and globally, working across issues like gender equity, ecological and climate justice, socioeconomic security, and so on. So really excited to have Noelene here today. Let's give her a warm welcome. And then next to Noelene is Estelle Clarke. She's a Yorta and Wemba Sistergirl, and I met Estelle through Youth Climate Justice Organising. You can see the Don't Fruck the N t-shirt there from the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Shout out. She's also the training coordinator and programs and training coordinator at BlaQ, with a Q, Aboriginal Corporation. And then finally, let's give you a round of applause. I know, I got interrupted. And then Malachi Garza is an activist and organising director at Solidaire. Over 2 decades has done social justice work spanning community organising, popular education, justice work, and currently is working to mobilise the financial and strategic resources for frontline climate, racial and gender justice movements. So welcome, Malachi. So we're going to start with you, Estelle, and we're going to just hear from each of you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do and the issues you're most passionate about?
I've never had a mic like this before, and so I'm just making sure that the hearing back doesn't make me dysphoric, but I think we're fine. My name is Estelle. I'm a Yorta Wemba woman. I grew up on Noongar Whadjuk and left there about 8 years ago and have resided on Gadigal country ever since. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and remind everyone that white Australia has a queer black history and sovereignty was never ceded. So as you had mentioned, I am an Aboriginal trans woman. I've worked physically as in my full-time job for a couple of years now, but I've advocated on queer and black issues for over a decade now. I think I started when I was 15 in Perth, focusing on that intersection because there was such invisibility, which isn't the case now, thankfully. We've seen the gathering space and all of the beautiful ways that mob held themselves together through this World Pride period. Yeah, I'm so sorry also. I'm exhausted. Mob have had to carry so much this festival, so I'm sorry if my brain is not on. But yeah, queer blackness and all of the multiplicities that we experience as a community is my focus.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Estelle. Noelene, I know you have a couple of slides, but I'd love to hear a bit about you and the work you do and the issues that you're passionate about.
Thank you. Acknowledging we're on always was, always will be Aboriginal land here, and giving my respects to elders past and present, and also to all Indigenous First Nations, Aboriginal people in the room. My father is Itoke, or Indigenous Fijian, comes from Kandavou, which is down the south end of Fiji, from Dravoa-Lunadeva in Kandavou. My mother is settler Australian, so I straddle many, many different worlds on many different issues. I'm part of a wonderful LGBTQ collective called Diverse Voices in Action for Equality, started in 2011, came out of a series of sets of violence and transphobic behavior by coaches and sports, kind of sports managers. And out of that small beginnings, I think we were on like $10 a month or something as our transport allowance. Over the 11 years, we've really grown and tried to go where constituency is telling us to go. And that's led us to really 5 sets of work streams. The first being around bodily autonomy and integrity, and universal human rights. The second being a link between socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice. We've done that for 11 years, and it's nice to see it being validated finally. People looked at us like we were bizarre that an LGBTQ collective was working on these issues. Thirdly is just so much trauma and hurt within our activist and social movement communities in the Pacific, and so that's our third set of work. And the fourth is coming out of the challenges of loss and damage. And yes, the violations of human rights, but the loss and damage that we're feeling already and have been feeling for decades now and rising in the Pacific. And the last one is really an inward-facing goal for ourselves and saying, how does a small organization of 8 staff, but 23, volunteer sets of hubs across Fiji and then outward to the region and transnationally. How do we genuinely and respectfully and healthily move our issues from the local to the national to the regional to the transnational and back? How do you genuinely do that as constituency? So I'll just say the first slide really tells you that where we are now? Yes, we've crossed at least 6 of the 8 planetary boundaries. So, for me, it's not a question of do I choose to work on these issues or those issues. They're all impacting on us as LGBTQI people. And now we're joined, our organization works with over 250,000 Indigenous women through the Song of Akmarame Itoke, but we also work with many, many communities and institutions, and it's hard. Like, it's tough to work with the nation state when most of the time they don't even want to let you in the room. But this is where we are right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but to be truthful, there's no rights on a dead planet. And we're in such trouble ecologically across the world, and there are reasons. There are people and there are societies who are making that real, who are making that reality real. And we want to talk about that as queer bodies. We want to talk about that as individuals and as people with group rights as well. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. And then finally we have Malachi. I'd love to hear a bit about the work you do and the issues that you're really passionate about.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I also want to acknowledge the Gadigal people, past, present, to come, this unceded land. My name is Malachi Garza. I'm here from California in the United States. And I live and was born on the Ohlone lands, another unceded territory there. And I would like to lift up a model. I believe that acknowledgement rings a bit hollow if you're not working to build power. And so there's a model called the Sigorte Land Trust and Land Tax, in which we pay small amounts collectively that end up pooling resources to allow people to buy land back. That goes along with the acknowledgements that we say. In the last 25 years, I've been working to build power, and mostly in the lanes around countering police brutality in trans community, the hypercriminalization of LGBT and young people of color, the Latinx community, and the call-in and invitation that are social movements and political movements for racial justice, such as Black Lives Matter, such as Standing Rock and Land Back. And then lastly, working with philanthropists in the United States to unlock millions of dollars that are being hoarded, somewhat also by progressive people in movement spaces and institutions, and unleash millions, if not billions of dollars with no strings attached for multi-year grants to the front lines of social justice. And the little bit about where we're at now, you may have noticed the rising tides of fascism sweeping across the United States. You know, it's a thing. That is happening largely in response to summers of the largest racial justice uprisings and protests in the United States history. We passed over 350 bills that would rein back murder as rule by police in our communities. And as such, we've seen a criminalization of protest sweep the country. We've had advances for gender sovereignty and around trans liberation. And just today, there have been bills announced that would restrict health care for trans adults as well as children. And so much like climate catastrophe, with the rising tides of the ocean come the rising tides of fascism. And they're here and they're courting across our country for people to join them and talk about our movements that should be moderate and slow and paced out and not too much. And we know that the freedom we want sees all of us, and the freedom we need is urgent. And we must become ungovernable if we are to save our lives and save this planet.
Thank you.
You're doing an impossible job. How do we moderate such a broad range of things that have been shared over the course of these introductions? Looking at the big global issues we're facing, the intersectionality, the issues that LGBTQI people face, and how do we kind of thread all these together for justice? But we thought we'd start inward first and then build our way back out, and wanted to start looking inward at the LGBTQI plus movement, wherever you're based. And what are the issues around intersectionality that you see in the LGBTQI movement? What could we be doing better? And what, if any, are the things that you want to really lift up that are going well in terms of intersectionality within our queer movement? So I might start back with you, Malachi, and then move back down.
Okay. So I'll try to be brief. I think a key thing that I cannot help but being in this conference and thinking about for more access into our movement spaces and to grow our mass, we have to demand more and we have to open more. We had a panel up on the stage of American Express and corporate leaders getting lots of claps for putting a flag on as thing to swipe your card, when for a drop of the bucket, Kohl's and American Express could have made this conference free to oppressed people in this place. We have to demand more if we're going to open our movements to the masses of people we need to create change, period. We are accepting crumbs and thanking them for coming. The other two things I'll say is to unite around our key sites of crisis. So like I mentioned in the United States, the idea around body sovereignty and gender and sexual liberation. We have the putting into law outlawing abortion and people's right to choose when to give birth. And we also have attacks on trans bodies and liberation. We have a clear then call to build feminist solidarities that center trans women, center women of color and low-income women in our movement spaces. And the last thing I'll say is that in the idea of seeding more, part of what made our movements possible to do amazing things the last few years in the United States was flipping the script in our movements around who had power and who had resources. And so we know to get the freedom we want, we have to move beyond what is comfortable and move into things that are uncomfortable, such as in our movement spaces, seating who has their jobs in our nonprofits, who has our board seats, who is given access to resources and for how long. We have to have people with privilege and those resources be willing to give them up Uh-oh, the corporations turned on the fans. They're like, don't, stop all that. We can just talk louder. More land. So it means actually those of us who are owning class giving up our land, giving up resources, not hoarding wealth, right? It means redistribution of power and redistribution of resources in our lives and in our movement spaces. Redistribution of who's at those jobs, who's on the boards, who has those roles. So we can start there.
Beautiful, love it. Thank you, Malachi.
Thank you.
I'll hand over to you now, Estelle. What are you seeing in the LGBTQI movement here? What are the things that are going well around intersectionality, and what are the things we could be doing better?
I think there's such a massive undercurrent of racism within the LGBTQ plus community, like really, really unnecessarily like overt racism. And I think that navigating the queer community for me as a fair-skinned Aboriginal person is really interesting because like not everyone is going to know that I'm mob, and so then I will hear the ways that they express their racism in really uncomfortable ways. And so I also think there's this like perception that like queer people are like above the way that we hold other people accountable, and it's like, no, queer people can still be transphobic, queer people can still be racist and sexist and like aid in the colonial project, and it's like not talked about enough. And I think for me as well as a trans woman, sometimes I'm anxious of calling out these things because I'm afraid of the transphobia I'm going to experience from the queer community. But I think that racism is a huge problem that like white people just need to like not project their guilt and have it manifest into really uncomfortable conversations. I feel like white people just sit with the fact that you were a settler, you were part of the colonial project, and then also unlearn, and as Amani was saying, like decolonize the ways that you encourage that behavior. I think police brutality is also a huge queer and black issue, focusing heavily on like black and brown trans bodies. We all saw all of the police through this Pride season, and it's genuinely terrifying. Like when we see a group of them together, it's like you get shudders down your spine. Like you fear for the people that we've brought into this space and their well-being. And this is for them. We're at a human rights conference. Like this is for them, and we're enabling that behavior. And I genuinely fear for the well-being of black and brown trans bodies in the colony.
Thank you, Estelle. Really important truth-telling and stuff that we really need to hear. Thank you. And Noelene?
I hope it comes up. Can I have just the second slide? Thank you. So, when we started in 2011, we told ourselves that we didn't want to be the people who get pulled into a room to be the token lesbians in the room. And we still have that, right? We know that. And there are those who experience the same because they're trans or because they're intersex. There's many, many kind of groups who get pulled in. The same thing about First Nations people as well. So one of the things that has really helped DIVA for Equality in our organizing is, I'm 55 years old, and I always say that feminism saved my life many, many, many times. And I mean that literally as a person, but also in terms of this, I feel like we don't make enough time for us to think and to feel about our issues, and we're running from pillar to post by necessity, right? Because we have so many of us who are experiencing everything that comes from racism, that comes from heteropatriarchy, that comes from neoliberal capitalism. So there's so much, that we're doing every day. And the first thing that I'd like to kind of put into the room is we have to know our context and conditions, and we have to be political about that and be willing to speak it when people don't want to talk to us about those issues. So for instance, I'm in a region that, yes, has beautiful, unbelievable pride and articulation of indigeneity. But I'm also from a region that has double the global rates of violence against women and girls. And from our 2019 research, It's even higher for LGBTQ people who are part of our participative research. So we know the numbers are massively high for gender-based violence. And then the second one is we know that we have 50% unmet contraceptive needs, amongst the highest in the world. And that's telling us that there's not that negotiation of our bodies with others. And something is going deadly wrong in the way that we're looking at issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and SOGISEC. And then the next reality is that women in our region do 3 to 5 times the unpaid care, domestic and communal work of men in our region, and we have to talk about unpaid care work. We have to recognize, redistribute, but I feel also to reconfigure society, to really be willing to say, not just about international foreign policy, but at a domestic level, what is the state doing? It keeps saying that it is the duty bearer, and as we heard from the envoys, they are pushing from inside, but they require us to be pushing from the outside. And I feel like sometimes we silo our issues. So we're not talking about issues of poverty, and we're not talking about issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights or climate justice. So many of our villages are already being moved, and there's going to be 54 in the next 20 years. So there's a massive disruption already happening on social, economic, ecological, and climate rights, right? So as a queer body, I want to be in all of those struggles, because as we know, all struggles are interconnected. And the next thing is that we have the lowest rates of women in national legislature in the world. We have still a couple of countries in the Pacific where we don't have one woman. And that's not even any trans woman, or we had one trans woman stand in Fiji who didn't get into parliament, but really there's almost zero presence of LGBTQI people in our national legislature. And so how is it possible that we can even dare to call ourselves a democratic state, right? My own state became independent in 1970, but don't tell me you represent my needs and my rights as a citizen. You don't. And clearly we have to be able to have that assertive, direct conversation with the state and with society. And unfortunately, in our region, we have to talk directly about patriarchy and the ways that it is shown in all of these statistics, and crack open all of the doors and all of the ways that we require to be there at the local. We are kept out of our own clan meetings. So I'm not satisfied with that. I will fight wherever there is a way that I can struggle and resist so that we can be together in our fullness. If it's about liberation on all territories, then I want to struggle with all of you for liberation on all territories. That means, though, that I have to be able to talk to those in the North about what's happening with neoliberal capitalism, about the ways that the Bretton Woods institutions, the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the amount of crazy that we face in the economic South because of what they are doing about the politics about money and resources and power is unbelievable. So as feminists, for about 30 years, we've been working on a lot of these. And unfortunately, I find that there's still that silo. So all of those wonderful sets of analysis we have going down one channel, but it's not in the rest of the boats. And I feel like we have to build that together now and make sure that we're talking to each other. We want to talk to each other as feminists, as human rights defenders, as LGBTQI-specific working human rights defenders. We all need to be together. We examine carefully all of these systems, and we have to name heteropatriarchy. We have to name neoliberal capitalism. Yep. We're not even naming it in our conferences. Why are we not doing that? I don't understand. We have always been in the power of these movements. And I mean that as lesbians, I mean that as trans people, increasingly intersex people. We are the ones who bring the extra, who make sure that the conversation is not dumbed down. So I really want to encourage us, you know, as we move into the next, in Washington, woo, I think we should all be there putting in our feminist analysis. We work for right relationship, we work for justice and for balance, from the smallest ecosystem to the largest ecosphere. I keep saying to people, please, don't pretend like this is an issue that you are not involved in. every set of privileges and oppressions have a base in them that is around economics, and we have to reconfigure economics. It is absolutely an LGBTQI issue, so that's really what I wanted to end this part on.
Thank you. I mean, it's an incredible call to action. We need to build intersectional movements where we're working together to deal with these big structural injustices, whether that's you know, able-bodied supremacy or white supremacy or neoliberalism and so on. And so I'd love to throw back to the rest of the panel. Where are you seeing that happen? What does that look like? Where are the movements that are starting to this intersectional work? What are the lessons back in for us in the LGBTQI movement? I might throw to you, Malachi, and then we'll come back down.
Okay. Well, I think one thing that is often the case is that when things get dire, people find their way towards each other. And in the United States, as I said, something similar to, y'all have had a glimpse with the Australia First Party and the Australian Protectionist parties, I hear, is like the rise of your Trumpisms. We have had a rise of what I would call like unification and solidarity in our movements, given the sort of holistic and full front assault on civil liberties and rights in our country. There is also a growing clarity around the climate catastrophe that is, while other things are very crucial that we're fighting against and fighting for, if there's no planet to live on, then where are you going to get married? Okay? We have had a big clarity also on the power of mass engagement. And so for a long time in social justice spaces in the US, there was always a tendency to organize someone else. White people wanted to organize people of color. Middle-class people wanted to organize poor people. The housed wanted to organize the homeless. And there's actually been a big shift of people to organize your own people. Go get your brothers and your sisters and your they, thems, and all of us fabulouses in between. And as we've worked to build sovereignty and self-determination within people's communities, and people have had the courage to organize their families and their friends and their own communities, from that place, we're able to unite and build a real power and a real solidarity that shows up very differently. And when they do things like criminalize, for instance, now in the United States, you can have a felony charge if you blockade a freeway because of how successful our direct actions were a couple summers ago. But if you have 30,000 people taking over a freeway, it's a lot harder for them to arrest the 10 people and shut down what you're doing. And so the more and more people we engage in the struggle, that means your daycare worker, your auto mechanic, your clinician, your pharmacy worker, your garbage collector, if we see them all as protagonists in the struggle, as sacred people, and as worthy in participating in change, the mass character that we can take can become unstoppable. And they cannot legislate us out of existence. They cannot criminalize us out of protesting. And we can shift the structural barriers that we need to be addressing the root causes of our, what could be our annihilation.
Thank you. It's real here too. It's becoming illegal to blockade bridges and freeways here as well. So coming together across these rights to protest is really important. But for you, Estelle, I mean, we've covered so much, but in that kind of call to action around building intersectional movements, what would you like to see happen here in the LGBTQI movement, and what are the lessons you can learn from the other movements you've been involved in?
I think I would like to see larger queer institutions and queer organizations like sacrifice the power that they have that come from the sacrifice of us being sovereign and on this country. It's always like very, very hard to like convince a whiter queer organization that like us, and I work within an Aboriginal controlled community organization, which I think the rise of those as well has been really impactful in the ways that we've been able to govern our communities. But it's still a struggle. And we're still having to almost like tell people why we as blackfellas deserve autonomy over the decisions and the governance and the data and the money, and they don't actually, they're not entitled to that, because I think that there's a really large entitlement that happens here. I mean, like, someone was initially entitled to what they thought was an entire empty continent, right? So like, it's very built into the veins of this country. But I am noticing that there's slow shifts. There's slow shifts of like respecting Indigenous knowledge systems. There's slow shifts in respecting and acknowledging Indigenous power, queer Black power. We're finding that like when you actually do give your resources and you do give power back to First Nations peoples, what comes out of that is so much more impactful and intentional and purposeful than any white person could have thought up in a meeting. And it's saving lives. It's having Black people at the center of the conversation. It's having us on your whiteboards. It's having us in all of these different positionings to ensure that we are scattered and not siloed. So I think like it's happening like slowly, but we're still having to like tap well-meaning white queers on the shoulder and be like, actually, stop. Like, don't do this anymore. And we can do this, and let us do this. I think we're so proud of our community. Like, the queer Black community, the queer First Nations community here is such a proud community. And we're proud alongside all of the pain and suffering and the injustices we've experienced, and we still have hope. And I think that that's consistent across First Nations communities across the globe, is like we're still fighting, and we will continue to fight, because our hope cannot be diminished, no matter how strong the colonial hand is.
Well, we could be here all day, thank you. Yeah, it is extraordinary the amount of change that's been happening over the last decade, and it is hands down to the protests and the community organising led by First Nations people. We're just going to go back down the line and hear final remarks, and I would love to give you a chance, Noelene, to kind of share your reflections on how we build these intersectional movements and what you've seen, but also what's your final takeaway for the audience here today, if there's one thing they would take away?
I mean, the first thing I would say is be personal in your politics, and that means about organizationally as well as individually as an activist. I very proudly say I had absolutely nothing to do with the Australian government for the last 9 years until just lately. I didn't go to any of their workshops. I didn't go to the High Commission in Fiji, and they know this openly. There's no way that I wanted anything to do with that particular government. And our organization took that same stance. And the second thing we did was, it's very hard for us to be engaged in the politics of the US because of the imperialism, because of their position that they take on climate change and climate, we need them with us in climate justice. Right now, we have the International Commission of Jurists is going to have an opinion that comes out of their work that is about human rights and climate justice. That was put together by young people in the Pacific. Australia just signed on at the last moment, thank you, and it's 105 governments who are with us in the UN General Assembly. And I say that because we forget that all of these sets of politics, the geopolitics of the region, really impacts on the lives of LGBTQI people. So I want to say everything that we do is highly politicized. Let's not pretend it's not. We moved out of a coalition and refused $250,000 every year, and we all know how hard that is, because they were not demonstrating that they're with First Nations people here in Australia. Some of those things we don't speak about, but it's in the doing of those things that we are in solidarity with each other. So that's the next thing I'd say. And the last thing is, really, intersectionality is not about just naming our identities. It is about working out how power shifts and moves through all of our identities and how they come together and play off against each other. And that's the wonderful thing that our movement has contributed to the work for justice. And I think that's the last thing that I'll add is we've got to do more of that. We've got to be political. One of my friends who's here has this amazing shirt that talks about "My pride is political." Damn straight it is, and we will keep building those politics of radicality, of balance, of justice, because we're working for ourselves, for other species, and the living planet. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Noelene. What about for you, Estelle? What's the thing that you'd like people to take away from today, from your session?
I think I want people to realize that the work is like never done, and we are always running on exhausted, like always. And I think like a lot of that exhaustion is just literally having to fight colonialism, having to challenge it, having to critique it, having to highlight it. Like that cultural load that we have as First Nations people as well, when we're having to navigate these structures because we want to care for our communities, we want things to improve, we want things to get better. And to do that, we're then having to sacrifice our own IP, our emotional labor, our connection, you know, our community. And it's terrifying. I think as well, I don't know if I'm like making this slightly too meta, but I can see the Q&A questions, and someone asked about disability in terms of intersectionality, and I think that this is a really important thing to talk about. I think that even within this particular conference, it's failed those needs in so many ways. But also, I don't think that many of us are surprised about this. Because that specific area of it's like that specific intersectionality and what we need to do in that space is huge. I think it's one of the next largest things that we will start to like really try to like holistically care for. And hopefully it's the last one that we have to do a whole bunch of work for, because we've been here for so long, we've been like navigating these spaces for so long. My brain is fried. I'm so sorry, everyone. I think to end, the Labor government just announced $26 million worth of funding, research funding. I think while we're all like, this is amazing, this is great, I also think we have it within our power to demand to know how much of that is going to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to do that work. We demand to know how much of that is going into people with disability, people in the entire space. Like, I don't think it's enough to be excited about that. I think that we need to break it down and hold it accountable and understand where it is going, because I can 100% tell you, I do not want my needs looked at and researched by a white organisation. It doesn't respect who I am as a cultural person, and it doesn't respect decolonising these structures. And as Narelda said on the first day of the conference, like putting First Nations people first often encompasses everyone, because Indigenous knowledge systems are so encompassing of everyone. And to give power back and do the work.
Thank you. Thank you, Estelle. And Malachi.
Okay, in closing, I think one thing that has kept rolling around in my mind is that the antidote to anti-authoritarianism is you, and is all of us. And in thinking about what are we willing to give up, what are we willing to risk, what are we willing to take up, and how boldly will we leave? There's a need for us to love a pride flag that is not about boundaries and borders, but is about freedom, that sees all of us and that fights for all of us. There is a call to action for us to boycott, to blockade, to demand more, to stop business as usual, so that we will have the future that all of our people deserve. Our love for each other, the love within this work that is sad, that will break your heart over and over and over. The way that we keep going is by loving each other so beautifully, that our work is irresistible, that we give each other lots of comp time and time off, and health care and generosity, and that we work to feed each other's families while we're also in the meeting strategizing about the campaign. That we love so audaciously and beautifully that people want to join us en masse. And then I will just say that there is also a quote from Assata Shakur, who's a Black Panther in the United States, who said, first thing the enemy will do is isolate revolutionaries from the people and make them hideous. And one of the things we've seen in the US is that the leaders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza, have been demonized in the media and on social media as money hungry, buying property, right? They've used old tropes of Black criminality to demonize our leaders, and people are falling for it. We have to love our leaders, especially when we reach scale, especially when we're threatening to the status quo, because they are dedicated to our liberation and they work tirelessly for us. And sometimes we really do eat our own, right? It is up to us to love each other as we reach scale and as we govern, and as we watch people like y'all take up mantles of leadership. It's on it has to be in our minds and hearts to do our part. And I will just end with saying, if this conference comes to DC, let's learn the lessons then from this conference, or the movement will come for you. We will shut it down if it is inaccessible. If it does not center economic justice, does not center accessibility, then you know the movement won't come for you. So let's do a beautiful conference in DC that takes the lessons from here and just makes it bolder and stronger. And let's get it done.
There is so much to take out of this, and I'm not even going to try and summarize, but I just want to take a moment to thank each of our incredible panelists: Malachi, Garza, Estelle, Clarke, Noelene, Nabulivou, sorry. Let's give them all an incredible round of applause. I'm so grateful. It's been an absolute honour, and absolutely follow each of these three work. The work you're doing is incredible and inspiring for all of us. I think it makes each of us feel seen in this movement, and also encourages us, those of us who've experienced injustice, to step forward, and for those of us who experience privilege to step back and hand back power. And when we do that, our movements will be stronger and we'll all be liberated. So thank you, each of you. Let's give them a round of applause.